My name is Ernesto. I am 78 years old. For nearly 8 decades, I believed that the sweat from my hands and the love I gave would be enough to sustain the respect and affection of my family. I worked until my body cried out for rest. I endured sleepless nights, cared, protected, and gave. There was no sacrifice too great when the reason was them. I always thought that when time took my strength, I would take at least some of the care I dedicated to myself. I always imagined that when the weight of age arrived, I would find comfort in the arms of those I once carried in mine. But life is cruel when the masks fall. One silent afternoon, as I tried to approach, to offer even a word, I heard the most brutal sentence a father could hear. Before that came the gesture I will never forget. One of them spat in my face, not out of momentary anger but out of calculated contempt. A gesture that said without words, "You mean nothing to us." And as if that weren't enough, the sentence cut through the air like a sharp knife. "You don't mean anything to us anymore." In that moment, I felt as if the world had collapsed around me. It wasn't just the disgust in the gesture, it was the cruel sentence that all the years of dedication, all the sacrifices, all the love were no longer worth it. I returned to my room in silence, washed my humiliated face, and looked in the mirror. I didn't just see a tired old man. I saw a man crushed by ingratitude. But there, faced with that reflection, something began to change. Because I realized that my story couldn't end in that scene. They thought they could spit in my face and erase my dignity. But what they didn't know is that God still had an outcome written for me. Before I was reduced to nothing by the cruel words of my own children, I was much. I was a worker, a husband, a father, a provider. I was a man who believed that the sweat on my brow was the greatest gift I could leave those I loved. I was born poor, in a forgotten village, where life taught me early on that nothing comes for free. My father died when I was still a boy, and my mother, her hands weary, struggled to feed us. I grew up with an axe in my hands, chopping wood to sell, learning to trade brute force for pocket change. I never went to school like the other boys, but I learned to add and divide at the market when they tried to cheat me out of change. When I met Elena, my wife, I made her a promise. As long as I live, you and our children will never know hunger. That phrase has guided my entire life. I've worked as a bricklayer, a carpenter, a night watchman, and a grocery store porter. I've pushed grocery carts until my back screamed with pain, but I've never let food go missing on the table. The children came one by one. I remember the first time I held Miguel, my firstborn. My calloused hands trembled, afraid of hurting that fragile baby. I told myself no sacrifice would be too great. And after him came the others, and with them, more responsibility. But I didn't complain. On the contrary, every sleepless night, every loaf of bread shared, every drop of sweat shed during hard work tasted like victory, because it meant they were growing strong and healthy. Elena, my partner, often asked me to rest. I would smile, stroke her hair, and say, "I will rest when they no longer need me." That's how I spent decades, silencing my desires, silencing my own dreams to fuel theirs. I never allowed myself to complain. I never asked for recognition. I believed that one day my children would look at me with respect and pride, even if I had no titles, no fortune, no large inheritance to leave. But life, cruel in its irony, showed me that I was wrong. And it was just when my strength began to fail that I realized those I had supported so much were now the first to let me fall. The signs didn't come all at once. If they had come as a direct blow, perhaps I would have prepared myself. But no, they came like poisoned drops, small actions that, added together, corroded my soul. I remember the first time I noticed the change. He was sitting at the table, trying to join the conversation. I told him an old story from the time I was carrying cement blocks to build our first house. Mid-sentence, my son Miguel interrupted me with a forced smile. "Dad, we've heard this 1,000 times. Don't you have anything else to say?" Laughter echoed around the table. I fell silent. I chewed silently, swallowing my food with a tight throat. It seemed small. It seemed like just a joke. But inside me, it felt like a stab. Then came the stares. Every time I took too long to get up from my chair, I could see the discomfort on their faces. Once I dropped a glass on the floor, and before I could bend down to pick it up, my daughter-in-law sighed loudly. "Better leave it alone. He's just getting in the way." Another heavy silence followed. No one defended me. Conversations began to happen without me. They'd decide on household matters, plans, changes, and I'd only find out later. When I tried to offer my opinion, they'd cut me off with curt remarks. "No need to worry, Dad. That's none of your business." It was like I was just an old piece of furniture taking up space. Even my grandchildren, innocent, began to repeat words they heard from their parents. "Grandpa's forgetful. Grandpa doesn't understand things." They said it laughingly, unaware of the weight of what they were saying. But to me, each laugh was a reminder that they were learning to see me as useless. I slowly began to retire. I would sit on the porch alone, looking out at the yard where we used to run and play together. The silence, which had once been rest, was now a prison. It was during this period that I realized I was no longer seen as a father or a grandfather. I was just an old man getting in the way, and that seed of contempt, planted in small phrases, would soon grow into a gesture and a sentence that would crush me completely. Over time, what had previously been disguised as jokes or veiled comments began to be said openly, without shame, as if my presence no longer deserved respect. The small barbs became spears, thrown in front of everyone without the slightest shame. I remember a Sunday lunch. The table was plentiful, the voices were loud, and for a moment I thought it would be a day like the old days. I sat in the corner, content just to be near them. When I reached for a piece of meat, my daughter-in-law pulled the platter away before I could reach it and said with a dry smile, "Leave it to the younger ones, Ernesto. You've already eaten enough in your life." The table erupted in laughter. I lowered my hand slowly as if its weight were more than I could bear. I chewed slowly what little I had left on my plate, swallowing not only the food but also the humiliation. The other night I sat by the fireplace to warm myself. The cold bit into my weary bones and I thought I'd find some comfort there. But before I could settle in, I heard, "Father, you take up too much space. Make room for others." I got up silently and stood in the corner, watching the fire from afar, feeling the heat escape me, both from my body and my soul. The cruelest thing was when I tried to give Miguel, my eldest son, advice about a house repair. I've always been good with tools, growing up fixing whatever needed fixing. But he interrupted me, laughing disdainfully. "Father, you don't understand these things anymore. You're out of date." The words echoed like a sentence, outdated, as if my entire life had become obsolete. Every day, my place in that house diminished. From a father figure, I had become a nuisance. From a role model, I had become a burden. Even my silence seemed to irritate them. And so, slowly, they pushed me out. Not physically yet, but emotionally. I was no longer part of the conversations, the decisions, or even the memories. I was just a burden to be borne. And inside me, each word and each gesture accumulated, preparing the ground for the day when humiliation would come as a final blow. A gesture and a phrase that I will never be able to erase from my memory. The days grew increasingly burdensome. I was no longer called to anything. Meals came without invitation. Sometimes I served myself, in secret, so as not to disturb anyone. When visitors came, I noticed the looks of shame, not because I was poorly dressed or dirty, but because I was there. I, the father, the grandfather, had now become a nuisance even to strangers. I started to notice something even worse. They no longer talked about me as a person. They referred to me as a problem. "He's a handful. He doesn't know how to take care of himself anymore. It just gets in the way." I heard phrases like these coming through the walls as I pretended to be deaf on the balcony, and each one was like a shovel full of dirt thrown over the memory of the man I once was. I remember one afternoon in particular. I was tired, with aches and pains, and I sat down in the living room chair. It was the same chair where years before I had fallen asleep with my small children on my lap. Now, seeing me sitting there, one of them said sharply, "Get up. That chair is for others. You're already taking up space." I obeyed silently. I stood up slowly, leaning on the arm of the chair, while swallowing the pain that burned not in my bones, but in my soul. Even my grandchildren, without malice, repeated what they heard. "Grandpa just stands there. Grandpa is useless," they laughed. I smiled too, so as not to show how broken I was inside. But when I was alone, the tears came, thick and heavy. It was then that I understood once and for all. They no longer saw me as a father nor as a grandfather. They no longer saw me as Ernesto. I was just an old man, a burden, something to be discarded. And that cruel certainty would be confirmed the day humiliation surpassed all boundaries. The day harsh words weren't enough. They needed a gesture to seal their contempt. They spat in my face and told me I meant nothing anymore. The scene that sealed it all still burns in my memory like an unquenchable fire. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind I'd sit on the porch, watching the trees sway in the wind and trying to find solace in the memories of Elena, my wife. She was no longer here, but I always imagined her voice telling me to be strong. That day I heard an argument inside the house. They seemed nervous, talking loudly about bills, about responsibilities. I decided to approach, trying to offer a word of calm, perhaps some advice. I walked slowly into the room, leaned against the doorframe and said, "My children, life has always had problems, but if we stick together, we find a way out." They turned to me with heavy gazes. Miguel, the eldest son, whom I had so often carried on my shoulders as a boy, stared at me with contempt. And before I could finish my sentence, a brutal gesture struck me. He spat in my face. I stood still, feeling saliva drip down my wrinkled skin. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the symbol. It was the declaration that I was no longer human to them. And as if the gesture wasn't enough, the sentence came, cold, cutting, definitive. "You don't mean anything to us anymore." The world stopped. My heart seemed to shrink inside my chest. For a moment I even gasped for air. I no longer heard voices, saw nothing. Just those words echoing like a death sentence. I didn't cry in front of them. I turned silently, walked slowly to my room and closed the door. Only there, alone, did I wash my face and burst into tears. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man I saw. Where was the Ernesto who built a house from scratch? The Ernesto who worked until his body gave out? Where was the father who supported his children and their dreams? The husband who promised Elena she would never want for anything? There, in front of the mirror, I realized that for them I no longer existed. But within the silence of pain, a seed still remained. A weak flame, almost extinguished, but alive. Because deep down I knew my story couldn't end in that room, amidst spitting and cruel words. And it was at that point, at rock bottom, that I began to gather the strength to get up. After that shameful afternoon when the spit in my face was accompanied by the cruel sentence, "You don't mean anything to us anymore," I spent days locked in my room. I barely left, only when necessary. The shame weighed more heavily on me than my age. My heart pounded as if I'd been physically struck. I asked myself, how does one put themselves back together after being reduced to nothing by their own children? But in the silence, something began to stir within me. It was as if a soft voice were saying to me, "You can't let your story end like this. They want to erase you, but your life is written in every brick, in every tear, in every sacrifice." One cold morning, I summoned the courage to go to the old wooden trunk I kept in the corner of my room. It was covered in dust, its hardware already rusted. Inside, I found pieces of my life that had been forgotten. Documents, receipts, yellowed photographs, old notes. I picked out one photograph in particular. Elena, smiling, holding baby Miguel, while I appeared behind, covered in whitewash, building the first walls of our house. I touched that image with trembling fingers, and tears flowed. Not from pain, but from memory. I wasn't a useless burden. I was the foundation. I kept digging. I found receipts for payments. From the children's school, from the doctor who treated Anna when she had pneumonia. Even a grocery bill where I'd bought only rice and beans for them, and nothing for myself. Each page was silent proof of who I'd been. I separated everything and put it in a blue folder Elena had given me years ago. The same folder where she said, "Here's your story, Ernesto. Don't let anyone forget it." Besides the papers, I grabbed a black-covered notebook. I decided to write there, with my own hands, memories no one could deny. I wrote through sleepless nights, selling my tools to pay for medicine, carrying bags of cement until my back gave out, sharing bread with Clara so the children would have enough. Every word I wrote was like a brick rebuilding my dignity. It wasn't just a record. It was a reminder to myself. I still existed. I still had value. I closed the notebook, hugged the blue folder to my chest and whispered, "You can spit on me, you can call me nothing, but one day you're going to have to listen." At that moment, I felt the flame within me rekindle. With the blue folder in my hands, I felt as if I were carrying not just papers but my entire life. Every receipt, every photograph, every note in the black notebook was a silent response to the cruel sentence that still echoed, "You don't mean anything to us anymore." But I knew that simply hiding that evidence wasn't enough. I had to speak. I had to break the silence. Their cowardice had grown because I'd kept quiet for too long. And now, it was time to reclaim my voice. I spent the night sitting on the edge of my bed, reading aloud from my notebook. At first, my voice trembled, choked by the tears that kept falling. But with each reading, it strengthened. I repeated phrases, rehearsed looks in the mirror. I didn't want to appear like a broken man, but rather a father who still had dignity. "You say I am nothing, but I am the one who built everything you have. You spit in my face, but you won't be able to erase my history. If I don't mean anything anymore, then why does everything here bear my marks?" I wrote letters too. One to Miguel, reminding him of the day I sold my watch to pay his tuition. Another to Anna, remembering the nights I stayed awake holding her hand when she had a fever. And even to my daughter-in-law, I told her about the repairs I quietly made to their house, never charging anything, just so they could live comfortably. As I wrote, I didn't notice the passage of time. The room, previously cold and dark, transformed into a memory workshop, where I reconstructed what they tried to erase. However, there was still a greater enemy to face: fear. The fear of opening my mouth and being silenced again. The fear of looking into the eyes of those who had spat on me. The fear of trembling in front of them and losing all the strength I'd been trying to muster. So every night before I went to sleep, I would bend my knees and say the same prayer. "Lord, do not allow my voice to be influenced by resentment. Give me courage so that when the time comes, I may speak truthfully." It was in this rhythm that I spent my days. Between rehearsals in front of the mirror and prayers on the cold floor, I found a strength I hadn't known existed within me. And deep in my heart, I knew the moment of confrontation was coming. There were days when I felt courage well up within me, and others when resentment threatened to consume me. When I closed my eyes, I could still see the moment the spit ran down my face. The gesture replayed in my memory like a whip. And at times I found myself wanting to scream, to break, to smite back. But soon after, an emptiness consumed me. I knew that if I let the hatred win, I would lose everything I had left of myself. It wasn't enough to prove to them who I was. I needed to prove to myself that pain wouldn't be my end. It was at this point that my prayers became even more intense. I would kneel before the bed, my knees aching on the cold floor, and say in a low voice, "Lord, take this poison out of me. I don't want to be consumed by resentment. If I have to rise, let it be with dignity." And little by little, I began to realize the real battle wasn't against my children. It wasn't against my daughters-in-law, nor against cruel words. The biggest fight was within me. It was against the resentment that tried to lodge itself in my chest and turn me into a bitter man. I took the black notebook and wrote a phrase that I repeated for days, almost like a mantra. "My fight is not to destroy, it is to remember. My fight is not to hurt, it is to rescue." These words became my guiding light. Every time the resentment returned, I read them aloud, like someone holding on tight to a rope to avoid being swept away by the current. I also began to remember the good things, as if I needed to remind myself that life wasn't all pain. The first bicycle I bought for Miguel, the simple birthdays when Elena made cornbread, the afternoons when Anna would lie on my lap listening to stories. These flashes of memory gave me the strength to believe that, despite the cruelty, there was still something to save. The blue folder grew in content, but within me a certainty also grew. I needed to face this, not as war, but as revelation. Not to return humiliation, but to restore memory. And I had no doubt, the day of confrontation was coming. And when it came, I wouldn't just speak as a wounded old man. I would speak as Ernesto, the man who gave his entire life for those who had forgotten him. It was on a Thursday morning that the moment began to take shape. I heard from inside the living room that they were planning a luncheon the following Sunday. Everyone would be there: children, daughters-in-law, grandchildren, a gathering that in other times would have filled me with joy, but now sounded like the perfect setting for the truth to be revealed. I felt my heart race. I walked to the desk and opened the blue folder. I touched every document, every photograph, every old receipt, like someone sharpening a sword before battle. There was my entire life gathered together, ready to be displayed. Not just papers, but proof that I was never the nothing they tried to reduce me to. I spent the rest of the day in silence, writing a few more pages in my black notebook. These weren't words of revenge. They were memories and recollections I wanted them to hear from my own mouth. I recorded details that wouldn't fit in documents. The day I sold my tools to buy Miguel's medicine, the night I walked miles with Anna in my arms, feverish, until I found help. I wrote each line as if it were my last will and testament. In the mirror, I practiced my gaze. I didn't want to raise my voice or show hatred. I needed them to see me not as a broken old man, but as a dignified man. Even with the wrinkles and fragility of my body, I practiced until my voice sounded firm, until my eyes conveyed the truth that words perhaps couldn't convey. The night before, I barely slept. I spent hours sitting on the edge of my bed, the blue folder propped up beside me like a silent companion. I prayed quietly, asking for strength that didn't come from me. Lord, tomorrow is not a day for revenge. It is a day of truth. Do not let my mouth speak with hatred, but with the dignity of someone who is still your son. When dawn broke, I put on the best clothes I still owned. They weren't new, but they were clean and well-pressed, the same ones Elena liked to see on me. I put the black notebook inside my briefcase and held it tightly to my chest. And as I walked to the room where everyone was already gathered, I thought of only one thing. They may try to silence me, but this time, they will listen to me. Sunday dawned with a cloudy, heavy sky, as if carrying with me the burden of what was to come. I walked slowly to the living room, where my sons, daughters-in-law, and grandchildren were already gathered. The babble of voices and laughter filled the room, but as I crossed the threshold, the sound gradually faded. The air seemed to freeze. Everyone looked at me as if I were an intruder. One of them even scooted his chair aside as if to mark his distance. But this time I didn't lower my head. I held the blue folder against my chest, as if it were an extension of my heart. I stopped in front of the table. I took a deep breath. The silence became absolute. I could even hear the rapid beating of my own heart. Then I placed the folder firmly on the tablecloth and said, "Today, you will listen to me." Some exchanged glances. Others smiled disdainfully as if I didn't even have the strength to finish a sentence. But I continued. "You spat in my face and said I meant nothing anymore. Well, here's my life." I slowly opened the folder's metal clasp, the sound echoing in the heavy silence. I took out the first photograph. Elena, young and smiling, holding baby Miguel in her arms, while I, in the background, erected the first walls of the house. I placed it on the table. That was the foundation stone of what you call home. If I meant nothing, you wouldn't be here today. I then took out the old receipts, already yellowed with age. One by one, I spread them out in front of them. Here are the medicines, the studies, the food. Each number here represents sleepless nights, days of work until the body can't take it anymore. I picked up the black notebook with its worn cover and slapped it down. And here are the memories you chose to forget. But I never forgot. I looked into each of their eyes. The room was silent. Even the children, not quite understanding, remained quiet. And I concluded with a firm voice. You wanted to erase my story with a spit and a cruel sentence. But today, before everyone, I affirm, my life does not end in your mouths. The silence remained. But for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt strength. I was ready for the confrontation. I held the black notebook in both hands. I felt its weight as if it were made of iron, not paper. It was the weight of an entire life compressed between those pages. I opened it to the first entry, written decades ago, and began reading aloud. March 5th, 1978. I worked 18 hours at the construction site. I returned home with bleeding hands, but happy because I was able to buy Miguel his first pair of shoes. He was asleep when I arrived. I placed the shoes next to the bed and cried silently, thanking God for my strength. I looked up. Miguel lowered his head as if unwilling to face the memory. I continued. October 14th, 1982. Elena fell ill. I didn't have the money for all the medicine. I spent 3 days eating only stale bread so she could recover. She cried when she realized it, but smiled afterward, saying, "You always find a way." My voice cracked, but I didn't stop. I turned another page. January 2nd, 1990. Anna asked for a new notebook for school. We sold my old bicycle to buy it. It was the first time I saw her write an entire essay without stopping, full of pride. I closed the notebook for a moment and tapped it lightly. Here is my life. Every page a surrender. Every line proof that I was never useless. The room remained silent. Not even the children dared speak. My daughter-in-law twisted her napkin between her fingers, not daring to look me in the eye. I looked at everyone and said in a firm voice, "You spat on me, but you couldn't erase these pages. You said I meant nothing, but every single one of these records proves otherwise." And in that moment I realized that for the first time in a long time, they were listening to me. Not out of obligation, but because the truth had silenced them. I turned a few more pages of the notebook, my heart aching with each memory. Some words were blurred by the tears I'd shed while writing them years ago. But now, before them, each sentence took on new weight. July 9th, 1993. Miguel fell ill with bronchitis. I worked 3 shifts in a row, sleeping on the construction floor to pay for the consultation. When I got home, I could barely stand, but seeing my son breathing better was enough to keep me going. I looked directly at Miguel, my firstborn, whose face was now flushed and his eyes were watery. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, as if trying to escape this silent confrontation. May 3rd, 1997. Anna wanted to study music. We couldn't afford a guitar. I sold my carpentry tools and bought a used instrument. I spent months improvising on the job using old nails and borrowed hammers. But her smile when she played the first chord was worth it all. I looked at Anna, my daughter, who covered her face with her hands. She was crying uncontrollably. I continued, my voice now firmer. "Do you remember those days? Maybe not, because you were too young to understand. But I remember every sleepless night, every piece of bread I missed, every dream I buried so you could have yours." I slammed the notebook shut, the dry sound echoing through the room. "And it was me of all people, that you spat in the face and said meant nothing?" No one answered, just silence, a heavy silence filled with shame. I hugged the notebook to my chest and added, "I didn't tell you this to humiliate you. I told you because you needed to remember, because you erased from your memories what cost me a lifetime." The room remained silent, but I could tell every word was piercing the walls of pride they had built. I opened the black notebook again. The pages were worn, some nearly falling apart between my fingers. I hesitated for a moment because the memory that followed was one of the most painful I've ever written. But if there was ever a time to speak, this was it. I took a deep breath and read aloud. December 18th, 2001. We didn't have enough money for all the groceries for the month. That day we only had a little rice and milk. I divided the milk among the children and told Elena I'd already eaten outside so there would be more left over. I spent the whole night on an empty stomach, but I slept smiling because they slept with full bellies. The words echoed in the silence of the room. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the scene come back to me as if it were yesterday. The cold of the kitchen, the faint smell of boiling rice, Elena looking at me with tears in her eyes but saying nothing. I looked at them again. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. How many times have I lied and said I'd already eaten, just so there would be some left for you? How many times have I thought I was going to faint from weakness at work, but I kept going because the fear of seeing you starving was greater than the pain? No one dared look up. The children, not quite understanding, stared at their parents in silence. I closed the notebook slowly and tapped the cover lightly. And after all this, what did I get? The spit in my face and the cruel phrase, "You don't mean anything to us anymore." I looked into Miguel's eyes, who was now crying openly, and then at Anna, who was trembling with shame. Do you know what those words mean? They mean they erased everything, that every night of hunger, every callus, every tear was thrown away. I raised the notebook in the air, almost like a banner. But it's all here, and no spit, no cruel word can erase it. The room remained silent. Only the sound of suppressed sobs and heavy breathing could be heard. And in that moment, for the first time, They began to face the weight of what they had done. I closed the notebook and left it on the table. I scanned each face before me one by one, until no one could escape. It wasn't just me who trembled anymore. It was them, cornered by the truth they'd always tried to bury. I looked at Miguel, my firstborn. I pointed with a trembling but firm hand. Miguel, when you almost died of bronchitis, I worked without sleep or food until I sold my watch to pay the doctor. I saw you coughing, and with each cough, it felt like my life was ending with it. Today you have healthy children, a full house, a stable job. And I ask myself, would you have gotten this far if I hadn't given you what was most precious to me? Then answer me. How did you dare to spit in my face? Miguel lowered his head, tears streaming down his face. But I didn't give him time to respond. I turned to Ana. Ana, my daughter, do you remember the guitar? That worn, used guitar I gave you when you wanted to learn music? I bought it by selling my tools. I spent months improvising at work, cutting wood with a borrowed saw. But seeing you play made me forget the sacrifice. And it was you, Ana, who kept telling me that I was out of date, that I had nothing more to teach. Was that fair? She covered her face with her hands and cried silently. Then I looked at my daughter-in-law, who always looked at me as if I were a nuisance. And you said so many times that I was just a nuisance, that I was nothing but trouble. But who fixed every burst pipe, every broken tile, every problem in the house without charging anything? Who carried bags of cement when your husband didn't have a job yet? Who did what no one else wanted to do? Me. And yet you laughed when they said I was useless. The woman couldn't defend herself. Her teary eyes said it all. Finally, I raised my voice to everyone. You've turned me into a burden. You've looked at me as if I were less than human. But I will no longer accept being treated like trash. I didn't come here to beg for mercy. I came to remind you that every achievement of yours bears the marks of my body. I slapped my hand on the notebook and the blue folder. You can despise me. You can try to erase me. But you will never change the truth. It is here, and before it you have no place to hide. The room was plunged into silence. Some wept softly, others just stared at the floor, crushed by shame. I knew it. The wall they had built against me was beginning to crumble. The silence weighed heavily. I could hear only their ragged breathing and the rapid beating of my own heart. Then slowly I opened the folder once more. From inside, I removed a yellowed envelope, carefully folded. It was the last letter I had written, not to a specific child, but to all of them. The letter I saved for the final moment. I held her in the air and said, "This isn't a letter of demand. It's not meant to shame you. It's just the truth you've tried to forget." I opened the envelope and began to read in a firm voice, although trembling with emotion. "My children, if one day you believe I mean nothing, remember, I was the one who built the walls that sheltered you, who warmed your cold nights, who fed your hungry mouths. I didn't need applause nor thanks. I just needed to know you were alive, safe, and happy. If today you see me as useless, know that a father's uselessness only exists when his children lose their memory." My hands were shaking, but I continued looking at them. I don't regret what I did. Every callus on my hands was love. Every night of hunger was a choice. Every hidden tear was surrender. You can spit on me, you can humiliate me, but you will never erase who I was. I closed the letter and placed it on the table in front of them. I no longer have the strength to fight with my hands, but I still have my voice. And today, it echoes as a reminder that I existed. I looked at each one, letting the words sink in. You said I meant nothing. Well, look at this house, the clothes you wear, the lives you've built. Every detail proves I meant everything. The room remained silent. Some wept openly, others simply hid their faces. Even the children, without fully grasping the gravity of the situation, sensed that something profound had happened. I picked up the folder and hugged it to my chest. You spat on me and tried to erase me, but my story doesn't end in your mouths. And without waiting for an answer, I turned my back and walked out slowly, leaving the letter on the table like an open wound that they would never be able to close. In that instant, I realized something bigger was about to begin. I walked slowly back to my room, the blue folder clutched to my chest. Each step felt like it carried decades of pain and surrender. When I closed the door behind me, The silence fell, heavy but different. It was no longer the silence of humiliation. It was the silence after the storm. I sat up in bed and ran my hand over my wrinkled face. I still felt the weight of the memory, the gesture of contempt, the spit that never seemed to dry. No matter how much I had exposed everything, there was still an emptiness inside me. I had shown them the truth, yes, but the wound in my heart remained raw. I looked in the mirror and saw myself, a tired old man, with red eyes, a broken soul. It was then that I murmured, almost without strength, "And now, Lord? I've done everything I could. I've told everything. I've shown everything. But the pain is still there. What do I do with it?" I fell to my knees on the cold bedroom floor. The tears began to fall, at first timidly, then in torrents. I don't want to die like this, carrying hate. I don't want my last memories to be spitting and insults. I need something greater. I need you. And in that instant, something different happened. There was no bright light, no audible voice. It was a calm, a silent presence that took over my heart. It was as if Jesus were there sitting beside me, whispering, "You have never ceased to mean something to me. Even when they said you were nothing, I had already said that you are mine. You are a son and a beloved son." I felt my chest open. The anger, the resentment, the desire for revenge. Everything began to dissolve like ice in the sun. And in its place came a peace I hadn't experienced in years. I raised my tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Jesus. Because even when the world rejected me, you reminded me who I am." That night, I realized that the true value of my life wasn't in the appreciation of my children, nor in what they said or did. It was in the love of God, who never abandoned me. And with that certainty, for the first time in a long time, I was able to lay my head on the pillow without a weight on my heart. The next morning, I woke up different. The weight that had been crushing me had lifted, not because my family had asked for forgiveness, but because Jesus had already touched my heart. The void they left was filled with the love that never fails. I got up early, made a simple coffee, and sat on the porch. The sun illuminated the backyard, and for a moment I felt as if Elena were there, smiling beside me. I held the blue folder, but this time not as a weapon, but as a testimony. Every piece of evidence, every page, every memory now had a new meaning. They weren't open wounds. They were signs of God's grace that had sustained me thus far. Shortly afterward, my children came to me. They entered silently, heads bowed. I saw shame, regret, and confusion on their faces. Miguel was the first to speak, his voice breaking. "Father, we made a mistake. We can't undo what we did, but can you still forgive us?" I looked at him, at Anna, at my daughters-in-law, at everyone. In the past, perhaps I would have used that moment to return the pain. But now, with a light heart, I could smile. "I've already forgiven you, not because you deserve it, but because Jesus taught me that forgiveness is greater than hurt." Tears welled in their eyes. My grandchildren rushed to hug me, and for the first time in years, I felt that hug wasn't one of obligation but of true love. There, sitting on the porch, with my children crying before me and my grandchildren in my arms, I understood. The greatest victory wasn't showing documents or remembering sacrifices. The greatest victory was allowing Christ's forgiveness to heal my wounds and reach the hearts of my family. They spat on me, saying I was worthless. But God turned that sentence into testimony. Today I know my story doesn't end in rejection but in reconciliation. Not because I was strong, but because He was faithful. And so old Ernesto, who once thought he was forgotten, discovered that he still had a purpose, not only to live but to show that even when all seems lost, God's love can restore even the most broken family.